Here at the Deep End, we've been in a conversation, but it's not a new conversation. Kenneth Burke wrote, "The unending conversation has been going on at the point in history when we are born." Imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in heated discussion, a discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is that they're conversating about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone on before. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of an argument, and then you put in your oar and you pull. Someone answers, you answer them, another comes, the discussion is interminable, the hour grows late, you must depart, and you do depart with the discussion still vigorously in progress. You know, I sometimes wonder that Marcus Borg used this often in some of his stuff, and he was a first century Christian scholar, interesting gentleman. But I wonder sometimes if the Deep End didn't really come out of that understanding that there's this unbelievable conversation happening, and we are it. We are part of it. We are not just part of it. We get to participate or not. I love it in that Kenneth Burke's thing where he says, and you put in your oar. You see, that's all we're doing here. And we want to welcome all of our listeners all over the world. And we ask you, put in your oar. Write me at redhawkthedeepend@gmail.com. redhawkthedeepend@gmail.com. Bob and Marianne and I would love to hear from you. We've heard from a number of you, and we're so thankful for that. This conversation, we're only 3 people, but we are convinced the podcast is being listened to, and people are participating in their own heads, at least, in this conversation that is unending. And believe me, the conversation has gotten absolutely crazy over the last 5 decades. It's gotten more complex, more semi-permeable, and more differentiated, and it's moving in finer nuances in all directions. And the conversation is trying to keep up with it, trying to somehow encapsulate it, give it a context that we can see as expandingness and that part that is resolute in our being if we want to live. The unending conversation, it goes in all directions. Bob, Marianne, I'd like to welcome you all. And, we've been in this conversation, Bob, you and I, for going over 50 years. Marianne, you and I, we're going on 15 plus years. So when I talk about this, where does your head go, Bob?
Well, it's funny you talk about us being in this conversation for 50 years, but I remember in the early years of the conversation, we used to joke around and we'd say to each other, we've been sitting under this tree having this conversation for thousands of years. And I can't help but think that intuitively we knew at that time, we didn't use the term everlasting or eternal conversation or anything like that, but somehow we knew what was happening when we started talking about questions and issues that went beyond the normal, hey, how you doing, how's the weather, and it really was so rewarding that we've never stopped, never even thought of stopping. Even if we've been parted for years on different parts of the country and so forth, we could put our oars back in and be pulling in the same direction in no time.
Amen. How about you, Marianne?
Well, I think I agree that it's a conversation that's been ongoing forever, and it seems like we're always revisiting these major themes. But I think what the difference is we start to have these conversations in the context that we're living in. So it may be a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years, but in our world and what we're dealing with right now, we have to apply those principles to what we're doing. And I think that, as we get new information and we start to have these same conversations over and over again, I think that you're right. We have, what we're seeking is to elevate the conversation beyond our own personal experiences into something that is bigger and greater, that includes all of us. And so it's just, for me, it's a lot of fun. I just love just digging into speculation and what if, and I really don't know that anybody really has any answers, but everybody has an idea. So sharing those ideas is great.
And you bring something up to me. It's there's only one game in town, and it's not money, it's not property, it's not any of that. It's growing. Do you have a growing edge? Are you intentionally involved in that? And my conversations have mostly been around that growing edge, and the tragedy of so many people not wanting to live there because of the anxiety it can produce. The conversation around that is so important to me. And over and over, it seems we need to reinstate our own intent to be part of this conversation and find a place to do it. I have a lot of friends, and they're in these little groups, and they go camping together, and they talk about their kids, they talk about the weather, they talk about the fire, but they don't get into anything heavy because they don't want to upset anybody. And I go, to me, and Bob, you said it, it's a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years, and we recognize that. I mean, we went back to the Upanishads. I remember sitting around our living room, tripping my ass off, thinking about, we're like those guys in the Upanishads in the rainy season, where they would get together and talk about all the things they thought about, and how they thought about them and to what end. And someone said, we got to write this stuff down, man. And that's what the Upanishads were. The whole conversation about life goes back to the first sound that was paired with something. Tree, rock, you, me. That's where the conversation began. Seriously, this is a really cool thing that we can participate in with our language, with our cultural views, and our ability to exploit more and more what it is we have in common and how essential those common aspects are. And
go ahead.
And just how all the little pieces now, and Marianne, this is what you kind of intoned, how do we now bring them back to the essentials to serve what is truly healthy, growing, wholesome life? Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say that what makes it even more exciting is the conversation. We can bring in members of the conversation that have been dead for hundreds of years through their writings, through other people's interpretations of what they did in their life. And I think maybe, at least for me, one of the things that really pushed me on this journey into this conversation was when you and I used to read Teilhard de Chardin, and we'd read it to each other on the way to work.
Yeah, we'd read a paragraph and then to go, WTF, man.
Yeah, what does this mean? But it was like there were three of us in the truck. There was you, myself, and Teilhard. And I feel like I know him like an old friend. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of different people. Alan Watts is another one. Baba Ram Das is another one. There are these people who've come into my life and joined the conversation that I never thought I would ever meet or never thought I would ever be able to really talk to them, but they have had such an influence that it is like they've been in on this conversation with us.
And they have, because it's important. I just want to say, they're in your head, man, and they set up camp in there, and then they become part of this huge conversation within us that allows us to more articulately participate in the conversation outside of us. Go ahead, Marianne. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, because even contemporary writers and contemporary people who I may never in person are very much a part of the way I think, the way I see things. I just read a book by Natalie Goldberg, and as I'm reading that book, I was so enthralled with this woman that it was like, oh my God, is she still alive? I want to go take a class from her. So I Googled her and looked her up, and she is still alive, and she's still teaching, and she's doing things. And so I ended up on her website, and I watched a presentation or a interview that she was doing, and she was telling the story about how she was doing a workshop in Arizona, and a woman showed up from New York for a weekend, and she said, I drove all the way from New York just to be here for this weekend. And the interviewer, and she goes, and I just was like, oh great, good to see you. She goes, I probably should have reacted a little bit more, like, wow, that's kind of interesting that you drove all this way for 2 days. And the interviewer said, why do you think that is? And she said, because when I write, I don't write on a surface level. I write underneath. And I think that's what you're talking about. When these writers are writing, they are tapping into something that is universal, that is part of this conversation that's been going on for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah.
And we are able to be a part of it, and it's exciting.
And they have helped us define those threads that are vital. Part of the deep end is to discuss and to probe the deeper side of those processes and things that life cannot do without, that consciousness cannot do without. And this conversation is part and parcel to the very essence of who we are as human beings. I loved Asimov's Foundation trilogy because he talked about the archive. You see, there is an archive that feeds this conversation, and the archive is always in a state of recalibration. For instance, the narratives of the Alamo that are coming out, how racist Jim Bowie was, the narratives of the South that are coming out. People don't want to really discuss those because it means they have to shift their understanding, and when they shift their understanding, they have to shift themselves. And that is very difficult for any of us unless you've made it a way of life. And there is what participating in my mind and my heart in the true conversation is about, is sorting through this non-essential. When we talk about fashion, for instance, we can talk about fashion from the deep end by seeing it as a cultural representation. And you can like archaeology, you can take fashion and you can show how as a woman's skirt became shorter because they were dragging on the sewers and on the street, people were getting sick, and someone said, we're getting sick because of germs, and women, their skirts, so the skirts got higher. And the diphtheria went down, and on and on. All these little pieces are part of a story that is the archive from which our conversation grows. And much of the conversation today is about the revisionist narrative that we really have to somehow accommodate if we're going to be a whole and healthy people. And that's owning our own, our own stuff, eating our crow.
Well,
we've talked about that.
Yeah, and in the book Humankind, what they're looking at is those stories that we are telling ourselves culturally are so massively important in how we see ourselves and the conversations that we're having. And digging into some of these long-held psychological determinations that are basically flawed, and that there's a whole lot of more that went into these things than we are aware of it. And so bringing all of this into the conversation, you're right, it's very uncomfortable. And you talked about how, going camping and talking about your kids and your grandkids and those kind of things. Those are people finding a commonality. I used to be in just amazed at all the different universes that were happening. There's an archers people, and there's people that go camping, and there's people that do play mahjong, and there's, and they live in all of these little universes. And to me, those are little respites. Those are places to rest and then go back and engage, but don't stop engaging in the conversations.
Yeah.
Right?
And,
yeah.
And I have to say, in my life, those respites, I'll respite with friends who are like-minded and like-hearted, but I don't want to respite with people who are vicious underneath the surface, underneath their little thing. And our narrative, what we're coming to in our own conversation, what we're coming to is what I call the fish stories of our own history. It's like we could do no wrong. We only caught giant fish. You know what I mean? It's this consciousness of pride that keeps us from owning the dark stuff. And yet we learn over and over from good psychologists that if you don't own the dark stuff, you'll never be whole. You'll never be complete. And that doesn't mean you have to become the dark stuff, because I don't think we are either the dark or the light. We are the dancing of the two. Again, go back to our podcast on the self. It's selfing, man. It's just a process. But I think that we are part of the huge conversation now is that we're getting over, or at least we're looking at ourselves and saying we've told ourselves a hell of a fish story here. The South was not noble. They were racist and they were cruel, and we have to somehow look at what it is that's racist and cruel in all of us if we're going to keep the conversation authentic and real. And I think that that's very difficult, and why a lot of people don't want to come into this conversation. We saw it with that general in Congress last week when he talked about, he read Mao Zedong, he read all these, Marx. That doesn't make him a communist. He's read critical race theory. That doesn't, he says, why don't you want to know this? And they basically don't want, there's people who don't want to know that, and there is a huge bulwark against people knowing this. And that bulwark is full of lies and misinformation and a whole series of other things, which is another point of the conversation, is sorting it out so we're addressing what is true.
Absolutely. And what you said earlier, Marianne, about the conversation taking place in our own culture, our own time, and so forth is so true. And when you marry that with the whole idea of cognitive dissonance and how we try to avoid anything that shakes up our worldview, and that's why you have these bulwarks that are based on all these lies, because that's the way our consciousness works. We tell lies to ourselves even when we don't know it, in order to keep our worldview intact. And that's why it's so easy for people to accept the lies, because it's comforting. And it's very, very difficult to step outside of that. And you almost have to trick people into it. That gets back to a lot of, the archetype of Hermes, the trickster, and how it's through tricking oneself that you open up a new door and are able to move into a new way of thinking.
Storytelling.
That's where good literature and good songwriting and good script writing it happens, because it does come in through a back door, and it does seep in, and it awakens something to where you're not the same as you were before. But you're not. Right. You may not quite be sure why, at least for a while. But yeah, I think that's...
And that's part of the conversation. When we're talking about the conversation, we are talking about Marvel movies. We are talking about tragic stories that, from that story of milk, the story of AIDS and all the stories that came out that helped us humanize people with AIDS. Remember that back in the 80s? AIDS were evil others. Yeah. And Reagan made sure we all thought that, but we didn't. and the conversation continued. I know people today who got the AIDS back in the 80s, and they're still alive, and they can't pass it on now. The conversation moves, and as it moves, the people move. And this is part of what we need to continue to do in our daily lives. This is why I have a problem when people take a respite and they can't talk about those things that might divide them. It's not a respite if that's the way it is. When my family gets together, we are loud because we're passionate. We don't even disagree for the most part, except when it gets to the really super fine nuances. But we're very passionate, and I mean, my daughter has some views of things that are just so rich and new to me that I just go, well, good Lord, that's interesting. So
well, and I think that's.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think that's it right there. It's the conversations between people that are going to change the structures, because the structures, you mentioned Dragon, they want to tap down those conversations. And that's why some of our basic, we just had the 4th of July, some of our basic rights, the right to assemble is so crucial to a democracy and a country that lives freely, because if people can't have those conversations between themselves outside of government or corporate influence, then that's where we start to get squashed. And that's where these conversations are so important.
Yeah. And I'm going to say it's important to know the basis of these conversations. Right now, the split in America is between two philosophies, John Locke and John Stuart Mill's. One has to do with the liberties of the individual, and the other is that the community itself takes precedent over the liberties of the individual for the sake of keeping liberties for the most people. It's an amazing split, and we're going to be going into that in some future podcasts about America's dividedness in that. But I want us to see that this conversation, you are a part of it. And I would love our listeners to take this conversation into their community lives and start talking about this stuff out loud. Now, you're going to piss some people off. You're going to get some people's hackles up, and it's going to make you not feel good. And that's okay. I have a friend, she's from Australia, and they moved here, they immigrated here. The mom was brilliant. She homeschooled her kids up to high school. And when she got to high school, one of the kids was in a history class, and they were dissing immigrants. They were just tearing them apart, one person after the other, and the teacher included. And finally, the daughter of this woman said it was the hardest thing she ever did. Her mouth was so dry. She stood up and said, "I'm an immigrant." And the whole class shifted. You see, that's the courage we need in the conversation. That's the place where we need to make it human. Remember in the 80s, we talked about this a few minutes ago, all the movies that came up about people with AIDS. What can I say? This is the conversation. This is how we digest what is new and different and something that needs to be accommodated for us to be more healthy and to create a more complete narrative about who we are. This is not easy, my friends. This is the real work of it. Now, I think Mary Ann put her finger on something early, and that's that it's a hell of a lot of fun, because you get to touch these places that are so human and so real that sometimes they make you feel extreme grief, and sometimes they tickle you so much that you go into a world of joy that is unprecedented in your life. The conversation, it is unending.
Well, and one of the things I think that your story illustrates is that we have to use our voice. And when we are in a situation, being able to speak up, But the other part of all of this is we have gotten to a place in this country where we cannot have conversations anymore, where we're being attacked just for having an opinion that is different from someone else. And that's where we have to, if we're going to be able to use our voices, we also have to be willing to listen to other people's voices. And I think that takes a lot of discipline and self-work to be able to say, I don't agree with you, but I will hear why do you think that way?
Yeah.
And I think that's very, very important for having meaningful conversations that are going to shift.
And now we're somewhere that is decidedly American, because America is the first country to base its existence on ideas, not on national identity. And it's an amazing. Meacham says this on that GPS with Fareed. He says that, you know, we're a country of ideas, and what's happening now is the ideas are being dogmatized in such a way that patriotism is becoming a religion, and by doing that, we actually cut ourselves off from the conversation of ideas because of the way religion works and all that. It dogmatizes. So we're trapped in an interesting place, and it's very difficult to even address that place because so many people are misinformed, and they have built a reality on that universe of misinformation. Bob?
Okay, I think we're getting toward the end, so I'm going to wrap things up. I got 3 things to say.
All right.
1, the conversation is becoming very, very complex these days. There's so much going on that it's a challenge to just keep it all straight. And I think, number 2, we need to fall back on these signposts, guidelines, guideposts that we've talked about in many of the different podcasts. In order to decide what parts of the conversation are we going to engage in. And that gets to my 3rd point, and that is there are some people that it's not going to do any good to try and talk to them. Jesus said, don't cast your pearls before swine, because it's just going to waste your time. So it takes a lot of self-study. It takes a lot of empathy. And it takes a lot of courage to engage in the conversation where it's worthwhile. Follow the guidelines. If you hear of someone saying something that is definitely harmful to someone else, then you know that conversation is going awry. And thirdly, you've got to know when to cut and run, because there's a lot of people out there who will not be open to this kind of a conversation, and you need to find the people who are going to be open to it and then fully engage.
Amen. Marianne, final comments for you?
You know, I think what you summed that up so beautifully, Bob, and I would just end with, you know, I got into a conversation about what we should be dangling in front of our youth, you know, as far as an incentive to be a good person and get on the right track. And I was accused of having a political view that this person had no idea what it could be, right? And so it's kind of like, I'm not going to, that's where you have to make those determinations. That's not a conversation. I was not going to go down that rabbit hole. I was not going to get into that conversation. That is that pearls before swine, because it's like, no, if you just want to fight with me about something that has no substance, I will not engage in that. But if you want to talk to me and you want to hear what I think and are willing to tell me who you are and what you think, I am all in for that. So I think that's the conversations that you're right, we have to be discerning in.
Amen. Amen. And you know, I mean, what I hear Bob and Marianne saying is, you know, in the conversation, you don't want to argue over the color red with someone who's colorblind. You just don't. And it's important to know if they're colorblind or not. Because the conversation needs to keep it essential and not a distraction. The conversation. You know, I know a lot of people who are atheists, at least they claim to be. I had a great conversation. I said, everybody's got a God. I don't care if it's golf or truth or science or what. Everybody has this aspirational part of us. And that's their God, whether they call it God or not. And yet some people reject God because they're rejecting an image of God. Well, let me just put it this way. Do you know how many times God has changed before your eyes? You know, if you're in the first, second, third grade, God looks one way. You know, God's our friend. We can please God by helping people. Likes to please adults. But, you know, when we get into the fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, God changes. When we get into the seventh, eighth, and ninth grade, God changes. And when we get into high school, God becomes metaphorical. What? Changing God. What God do you no longer believe in? The old man with a beard? He's way gone for me. We hope you all have a great week. Blessings on all you do, think, and be.